Okay, welcome to our Chapter 12 video where we're going to really look at land use and land use planning and kind of, start talking about how and why different areas around the globe have changed and developed in the ways that we see them today. And so basically our outline for this video is going to first look at the need for planning. So why does it come up? The historical factors or forces that shape the land use. So why does the landscape kind of look like it does today? And there are actually reasons behind that based off of, how early pioneers lived and then how they kind of developed as they begun to settle and expand across the landscape. And then we're going to talk about the factors that can contribute to the urban sprawl that we see happening today and that has happened into the past. And then we'll look at problems that are associated with that sprawl and so that spread of urban growth. And then we'll talk about land use planning principles, so how we can implement those planning principles. We'll talk about special urban planning issues, and then we'll finish up with some federal government land use issues. And so first, just to start off, we're going to look at the need for planning, right? So why do we need kind of land use planning? Well, as we've mentioned pretty much in every chapter so far this summer, uh, every developmental, impact that humans make, it will affect the environment in some way, and that's because everything is connected, right? Um, so you have this interconnectedness, and while you see the impacts, you know, and those impacts are pretty apparent in urbanized areas, there's pretty much no place you can go that has not had some kind of impact of human civilization, whether it's pollution or trash, and we mentioned this a few chapters ago. There's some sort of human signal or sign pretty much in any habitat or any place you go on Earth. Most land use decisions that humans make, so how they're going to use land, how they're going to construct on it, what they're going to put on it, primarily falls along economic decisions or short-term needs. So not really looking at the future. And when I mean future, I'm talking about, 100 years and on, so much later, and what's going to be happening. And some decisions aren't even made, past decades, past tens of years. And so that's a lot of the issue is that we're really looking at developing land based off of how we can make the most profit off of that tract of land now. And we're not worried about really what happens to that land in, say, a century from now or a few decades from now. And once you convert that land for whatever human use we need, you really make it unavailable for other uses. So for example, when you convert a forest or a wetland to an agricultural cropland, you're really only growing one crop per season. And depending on the type of farmer you are, you may rotate crops or you may plant almonds orchards on that. And then that will be an almond orchard for, you know, a decade or so until the trees outgrow it. You have to rip them up and replace them, etc. And so now that forest can't serve as any other resource, so you can't get logs from it anymore. You can't harvest, medicines or other resources from that forest. It doesn't prevent erosion anymore, etc. So you lose all of those other resources. Now, if we look at land use in the United States, 52% of the land in the United States is crops and livestock, so related to ag. 4% is intensive human use, and then the other 44% is forested or natural areas. Now, you probably say, well, that's a lot, that's half, right? One of the issues here, though, is the connectivity. So a lot of this land, you can't see that because my pad's being weird, but a lot of that land exists in fragments. And a lot of those fragments are too small to really have any impact on biodiversity. And as you start fragmenting that landscape, you get edge effects, you get changes in kind of the functioning of those habitats, and and so that leads to a lot of issues. But now there are still big areas, big swaths, big regions of land that are relatively intact. So that's not saying all of that's fragments, but a lot of it is. And the pattern of land use, so this pattern of land use is really different from immigrants that first settled the New World. And so whenever the first U.S. colonists come over, they experience Native American cultures and populations, and a lot of the New World was primarily forested and intact. Now, Native Americans did modify the landscape, but not to the intensity that we've done today. Right? So even in comparison with the colonists, that intensity is nothing near today, especially with all of the urban impervious structure conversion that we have today. But those first colonists, they even came in, converted landscapes to farming, then eventually towns, and then eventually cities as populations grew and grew throughout the history of those settlements. Now, one of the primary factors for the settlement of European and North America, so I should say Europe, and then the European North American settlements. And so if you look at kind of any travel through ancient times and even through, you know, 1700s, early 1800s, even late 1800s, really, and earlier, they primarily travel through waterways. They would take their ships, they would find a river on the coast, and they would go down that river, and they would find untouched land that they would then colonize. But they would build near that river because towns need water in order to survive. Not only do they need fresh sources of water, but water is very efficient. Traveling down rivers is a very efficient transfer system because that water is almost like a highway, right? It's already cleared unless there's like, some rapids or whatever. But most of it is really good for transferring, depending on whether or not it's a mountainous area or relatively flat. Now, what this means is that the waterfront will or did become the center of industrial activity because this is where the cities were developed. This is where factories were first built. And so a lot of that industrial activity started and then increased in those cities that were around waterways. Um, and as industrial revolution peaked and increased, we see that movement from rural areas to urban centers that we talked about, because those job opportunities are open because of the development of those urban areas. And North America was pretty rural until the last portion of the 1800s. This is because you have industrial revolution, more European immigrants, and you also have a lot of different opportunities in terms of cultural opportunities, social opportunities, and artistic opportunities. And just to kind of give you an idea of how important waterways were in terms of travel and expansion, the Lewis and Clark expedition was hailed to potentially find an all-water route across the United States. Now, they didn't find an entire water route, um, but they were able to travel across the continent, or fairly much across the continent, via rivers and waterways. Now they did have to portage and do some land travel, but that's how important the waterways were. Is that they did that whole expedition around trying to find that all water route. And um, if you are interested in a good read about Lewis and Clark, there is a book called Undaunted Courage, which is a pretty good nonfiction read about that journey. It's a pretty big read, but if you're into those kind of things, it's a really good read. I highly recommend it. And so what you see then is this rural to urban shift, and this migration from um, these rural environments to the cities. And then eventually you get a migration from the central city to the suburbs. So in early stages of the Industrial Revolution, with those factories just being started, nobody really knowing how waste and products are going to affect the environment, you get a lot of pollution and a lot of undesirable waterways. And then you also have roads becoming more common, trains becoming more common. And so people started having alternate ways to travel. So now waterways weren't really the faster ways. Now you have roads made where you can travel pretty efficiently by horseback and wagon. And then you also have rails that trains now travel on. You kind of have that expansion westward with the trains as well. And so you now have, and because of that kind of shift, you have agricultural land surrounding towns being converted to housing. So this is your suburbs, right? So this is the land that was around the city that was used for farming, but now because of population and migration from the central city, you get these suburbs to pop up, and land began to be viewed as a commodity, right? It's not a non-renewable resource to be managed. Okay, so now they're saying, okay, land is a commodity. This has a financial um, effect on our economy, and so it's not a non-renewable resource that is, or it's not, or okay, so it's a renewable a resource. There we go. It's a resource that we should manage, and manage it in a financial way. And when we look at the suburbs that were popping up, um, what happens is you have certain parts of the cities to begin to deteriorate. You get pollution in those areas because of all of the factories, and then the crowding from. So essentially, what you have is you have, let's say you have a region, let's say you have a city here. You have all of these rural populations moving to the city, right, to get jobs. So they're living in that central city. But then as pollution makes it undesirable, as waterways become bad because of the pollution, factories, all of those things, crowding, now you have individuals starting to move out just a little bit. Now all of this farmland that was out here is now being converted to housing. And now this area is your suburbs, right? And so the people who could afford to move out did so. So in 1950, you had 60% of urban population in central cities. 1990, that dropped down by half, 30% in central cities. So you still have this, migration outward to the suburbs. Um, and this is combined with the fact that we have automobiles, we have cars. And so this allows for commuting. This allows for that travel, and the decentralized housing patterns, right, because of the automobile start to happen. And then you have a diminished importance of mass transit because of this. And so you have a decrease in energy efficiency, and then you have an increased cost of supplying utility services. And so what this ends up leading to is this urban sprawl, right? So this unplanned low density housing and commercial development outside of cities. Okay? And so with this urban sprawl, you have land use practices that are fundamental to, to sustainability. And so what you have are zoning ordinances and low density planning. So zoning ordinances, they make sure this area can only be retail, and then this area can be family housing. So you have all your retail, your shopping centers away from your housing locations and vice versa. Now, low density planning, its purpose is to create access, automobile access to larger expanses of land. So basically leading to less dense living areas. So people aren't living right on top of one another, right? So instead of having like, 50 families per city block, right? Maybe you only have 25 families per city block. And I know these numbers aren't really realistic. You could have way more families per city block than that, depending on the size of the city and size of the apartments that you have on that city block. But just as an example, right, you're creating this low density planning because you're creating more or larger expanses of land that your homeowners are going to have access to. And these urban sprawls are typically characterized by lots of land consumption, low densities, lack of choice in ways to travel. You have this fragmented open space, um, lack of choice in housing types and prices. So this is like your cookie cutter houses, right? Um, so if you're in and around Merced or even in some of the suburbs around, say, some of the larger cities in the state, you notice that these houses get put up super fast because there's no variation in those houses. They're all pretty much the same housing types. They build them, and people will pay for them, and so they stay the same. So you get these cookie cutter houses at these set prices because people are paying for them. There's separation of uses into distinct areas. So again, your living areas versus your commercial areas, etc. That repetitive one-story development, that's similar to that lack of housing types. Commercial buildings with large parking areas, and then lack of public spaces and community centers. So this is very typical patterns of urban sprawl. And some of the urban sprawl that you'll see can be in kind of these three different ways. So you have development of exclusive wealthy suburbs that are adjacent to cities. You can have tract development, which is similar residential units over large areas. Okay. And then you have this ribbon sprawl, or what's kind of referred to as like your leapfrogging development, which is commercial industrial buildings lining highways that connect housing developments to the central city. Um, and if you have your cities merging into large urban areas, that's a megapolis. So let's imagine you have three cities, right, that are 100 miles away from each other in any direction. Okay. Now what happens is you first start out with those cities populated, and then you get your urban sprawl, right? Population's expanding. So they'll get, farther out of each one until eventually they're overlapping now. And so what it ends up used to having natural areas in between is now just one big, large urbanized area. And that's your megapolis. So here's images of your urban sprawl. So your wealthy suburbs, your tract development, which is kind of what we're seeing in Merced. And here's your leapfrog development, where you kind of have your roads that are leading to the central city. Right? Here you can kind of see the regional cities. So these big lights right, that we're looking at here, they're not all one city. These are essentially your megapolises, right? These are cities, large cities that have suburbs that are out connecting with smaller cities and making this really large regional city. You can really see that, that in the Northeast. You can even see the connecting city highways, the corridors that they travel through. Look at the east coast of Florida. Again, we've got Southern California where you see that near the Great Lakes. Larger cities there. A lot of transportation will go into Great Lakes and come out the ocean. Again, using those waterways. And so, lots and lots of urbanization and that urban sprawl, and it will continue as population increases. People will start to fill in these gaps, right? As long as you can live, you have resources, then people will start to spread out and fill these gaps, and you can expect these light sources to just get larger and larger as population increases and urban areas increase. Now, the factors that really contribute to the urban sprawl, we're going to kind of go over. One is lifestyle. So increased wealth of population is reflected by the things we have. So the materialistic part of our lives. So we have more possessions, and we tend to put that money into larger homes, larger properties, more automobiles. And so again, what we're seeing is this decentralized housing pattern because of high rate of automobile ownership that's allowing us the ease of movement, right? Allowing us to pack up and move out here if that's where we want to go. We have automobiles, we can carry us in those locations. And, I mean, I just recently moved from here all the way to here and did so within a week, right? That's just, you couldn't have did that 100 years ago, right? Just impossible to do it in that amount of time. And so, well, say 150 years ago, right? And so that decentralized housing is made possible because of that, right? So if I'm in this city and I know there's a tract of land, say way out here, that I can buy and purchase and move to, then I can do it, right? Because my automobile can get me there. Now there's this economic aspect of it too, where if you build on agricultural land, it's less expensive to build within established cities. So for example, there where the town I come from or just moved from in California, had a lot of people moving from the Bay Area, so around San Fran, right? San Francisco is fairly expensive. It's a pretty expensive place to live. 1 bedroom apartment, it's going to run you $1,500-$1,600 a month, give or take. Whereas you can take that $1,500-$1,600 a month rent, or if you own that studio apartment, right, you could sell it for $500,000-$600,000, move to the town in the foothills where I lived, and you can buy a house for $300,000-$400,000 with some land, and then you can put that other, $100,000-$200,000 in a bank account. And so it's financially better to move to that rural agricultural land than to build within the established cities. And then tax laws also encourage home ownership. You get better incentives, subsidies, etc. if you're owning your own home versus, say, renting or renting. There's also the planning policy of the city that allows cities to kind of govern how they develop. So early on, there was little to no coordination on how cities should develop. So large cities had very large political jurisdictions, so coordination was very difficult between those areas. Now what we're seeing is that, cities have zoning ordinances. So this tract of land is only going to be able to be used for, say, residential housing or commercial real estate or industry, ag land, etc. And so what they're doing is they're now preventing land use mixing. And that really determines how cities are going to be developed and where that development is going to happen. And so government subsidizes the development of decentralized cities. So what that means is local government will pay some cost of extending services into new areas, and those costs are not passed on to the builders. Okay. So they're kind of pushing for the development into these new areas. Now, these factors are contributing to the sprawl, right? So the spread from centralized cities to those rural areas to become developed. What we're going to look at now are issues that are associated with this unplanned growth. What happens when this urban sprawl starts to move outward? What happens when populations start to move outward from that inner city? So transportation was one big thing. So as those cities grew, we didn't really think about transportation corridors. The establishment of new corridors, it stimulates growth into nearby areas, and the new corridors will become inadequate. Right? And so because we're using automobiles constantly to move from the outer areas or from the city to the outer areas, we're using automobiles to facilitate that. I can live out here because I have an automobile that can take me into the city and then back to my house within an hour or so. And so the reliance on automobiles has required this constant road building, and then also the repair of those roads, the current, the continuous maintenance of those roads. So for example, in Los Angeles, 70% of the city's surface area is for automobiles, whether that's parking or roadways. The average person in the US is going to travel about 160 miles per week in an automobile. And if you commute, that number is even higher. This unplanned growth also leads to the central city to become run down, less populated, not being used anymore. And so currently, less than 10% of the people work in that central city. And so there's less income to support public services and other kind of businesses in that central city. When you have higher infrastructure and energy costs, or I should say you have, not when, you have higher infrastructure and energy costs whenever you have to extend those utilities outwards, right? So let's say you have an area and you have a power plant here, and you build a house in the city that's near that power plant. Running a utility line is not as expensive to this house as it is to this house, right? Going over that long distance. Then as you get farther away, right, you have to run it even farther. That causes your costs to go up. So the need for efficient infrastructure, right, because you need efficient transport of electricity this far out, and the cost to do that leads to higher energy costs. Um, and so that energy, those utilities are more costly in the suburbs than using services that are already in the city. You also lose open space and farmland when you move out of the city. Open space planning is left out of development plans. So we're not really, utilizing and planning for open space to be left. We're trying to use all of the land that we're developing. Um, Flat, well-drained land is really useful for farmland and urban areas. So they kind of overlap there in that need. Several states, though, have established programs that will provide protection to farmers who don't want to sell to land developers. And so what these farmers may have to do, for example, is put their land in a conservation easement, um, so that they can hold on to that agricultural land. So loss of open space, right? So all of this area is going to be utilized. There's really going to be nothing left. So you have forest habitat being lost, ag land being lost. This is one of the more common sites in Merced. You'll see fields being converted to ag land, and also rangeland. So there's a lot of grazing land around Merced County, and you see that happening. Out east, this happens more often where your forested areas are converted to urban areas. But you also see this in, say, the northern coastal areas of California and the Sierras, depending on how large that development is. What the urban sprawl also adds to is pollution, because we are relying on automobiles, which means smog happens, pollutions happen, and then also stormwater runoff. When you provide all of that impervious surface, water doesn't run and infiltrate into the ground anymore. Instead, it runs across the asphalt, it runs across the concrete. It can't drain efficiently, it can't drain appropriately, and so you end up with floods because of that storm water runoff not being handled appropriately. Okay, so looking at what's this? Let's see. Yeah, problems associated with unplanned growth still. Um, so air and water pollution. So we just mentioned that as traffic increases, as the use of automobiles become more and more reliant, air pollution increases. Um, a centralized public transportation can help solve, and I wouldn't say solve, but reduce this problem, because public transportation is still going to cause some pollution. It doesn't eradicate pollution entirely, but it gets rid of a lot of it from that individual use of automobiles. But it's really hard to have public transportation for a population that's so dispersed. If you're not from a rural area, you're probably wondering why this is so difficult. But I mean, you could just imagine. So, for example, my high school only had 400 students, but those 400 students were spread out over a very, very large distance. So, for example, our bus ride could be an hour long, and some of you may have a bus ride that's an hour long in the city, but that's going through traffic lights and kind of stopping at many, many different places. Um, our bus ride would cover like 50 or 60 miles in a day, in terms of traveling and dropping off and picking up students, pretty much going over like, a quarter of our county in terms of getting students to the high school. So those 400 students were very spread out and dispersed. And so it makes it really hard, right, to access a public transportation system that can benefit people that live in such a low density pattern. And then we also have large impervious surfaces that have high runoff and potential flooding, just like I mentioned in the last slide. With urban or these urban sprawls, you also have low energy efficiency. So again, automobiles, big problem, inefficient transportation, right? Kind of need to look at this. Public transportation. The fact that homes and businesses are separated means you have to do additional driving. Stop and go traffic patterns in cities leads to more pollution. Gas usage becomes less and less efficient as you enter that stop and go city traffic pattern. Single family homes are less efficient than multifamily dwellings, but then again, you have families who don't want to live next to or on top of other families, want their space, etc. And so that leads to more and more single family homes. And then you also have this problem of floodplains. So remember at the beginning of this chapter, we said that cities were mainly built along waterways because they were used as transportation. And so that means they're located in floodplains. And so this land is flat, so it's attractive to developers, but it also has to deal with the seasonal floods that happen. And then whenever you have large storms that come in, so for example, hurricanes on the East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico, around Texas, Florida, Illinois, not Illinois, but Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, etc. Um, the southern ends of those states really have low lying areas and flood really bad whenever they have pretty strong hurricanes come in or large rainstorms. And so those areas flood pretty regularly. And then the development that you create in these floodplains increases economic losses because you have these floodplain zoning ordinances, and you lose homes, you lose businesses, you lose whole cities um, to the floodplain problems that exist in these areas. Now, within these floodplains, these low-lying areas, you also have wetlands that are periodically covered with water. And so they can either be permanent or seasonal. A lot of these wetlands have been drained, filled, or used as landfills. For example, the Central Valley of California used to be a majority of wetlands that were fueled by the seasonal snow melts that would happen in the spring, early summer. It would bring these wetland ecosystems that house or served as stopover for migrating birds during the early spring, late winter season. And we had a lot of endemic life in California. We also had one of the biggest lakes in the lower 48, which was Tulare Lake. You can look it up and see old maps of it. Now that lake doesn't exist in the southern Central Valley because it was drained, filled in, used for ag and development. And so that's just kind of an example locally, California, where wetlands have been converted for development and ag. In total, though, the U.S. itself has lost 53% of its wetlands. So this isn't including Alaska. And as we've talked about in ecosystem services, wetlands are really important because they serve as or they have a lot of ecosystem services that they contribute. They contribute, like we mentioned earlier in earlier chapters, water filtration, sediment filtration, and then they're also reproductive sanctuaries for juvenile fishes, juvenile organisms. They'll go in these wetlands. They'll kind of hang out and hide out in the safety of those wetlands until they can venture into more open habitat that the adult phase of those organisms kind of use. The last thing I want to mention about problems with unplanned growth is geology and resource limitations. So the geology of the land has to be considered in the decisions, right? If you build on earthquake-prone faults, then you're going to have a lot of damage, a lot of loss of life. You build on unstable hillsides or fire-prone areas, you're going to lose, people are going to die, people are going to lose their homes. And we've seen this very often, especially in our own state, where, for example, San Francisco in that earthquake-prone environment. Southern California in the fire-prone environment, in the Sierras, fire-prone environment. Fire-prone also leads to unstable hillsides. When you remove that vegetation with fire, you increase erosion, and so there are large mudslides that happen after fires. And so these really aren't good areas to build, but we've done so, and so we kind of have to deal with those consequences from living in those areas. And then you also have kind of the aesthetic issues from growth, unpleasant odors from factories and landfills. You have tastes that are in the pollutants in the air or the water. You have noise pollution, so annoying sounds. You have sites that are basically site pollution, where you have to look at, say, ugly buildings or wind farms out in the distance, things that some people might not want to look at every day. And so these, though, are more kind of cultural, ethic based, where people, kind of disagree on what is acceptable and what's not. And some aesthetic boundaries can be looked at as unacceptable, but by some cultures or some populations and not by others. And so there's kind of a difficulty in determining these aesthetic issues when looking at kind of land use and growth. Now, moving away from problems, we can look at kind of how we can use planning principles whenever we're developing and um, making use of the land. And what we can go through is a land use planning process. So land use planning is when we go through a process to basically evaluate the needs and wants of a population. We also need to look at the characteristics of the land, what it can provide, and what its value is. And then what are some alternative solutions to the land and how we use it before we make any changes. Right, so let's say somebody wants to put a shopping mall on that land, on that tract of property. We should evaluate all of these things and then also look at what else could that land be used for. Could it be used for recreation and get a better outcome versus the mall, etc. Um, a lot of the problems that we've just talked about can be avoided if we do really good land use planning. And one of the kind of key ideas with effective land use planning is that you want to make as few changes as possible. The less amount of changes you're doing, the less likely you're going to do something that really kind of screws up the ecosystem and the environment and all of the interconnected interactions, whether it's based off of humans or not. Um, when changes are needed, though, when you do have to make those changes, you should evaluate and record all of the natural features. This is geological, geographic, and biological features. You want to make sure you're trying to preserve the uniqueness of the landscape, whether that's cultural or historical aspects of that landscape. Conserve open space, environmental features, keep that ecosystem function intact. You want to recognize and calculate the cost of additional changes if you alter that land use. So if changes need to be made later on, you need to kind of think about that and be like, okay, if this happens, what is the cost of that? And this cost doesn't have to be just financial. It could be, so not money we have to put in, but what is the cost in terms of ecosystem services and ecosystem health if those changes are also made. Um, you can do plan for mixed uses in close proximity, plan for a variety of transportation uses and transportation options. You want to set limits that require managed growth, and then encourage development in areas where there's already existing infrastructure. So that means you don't have to pay for new infrastructure and you don't have to make changes in areas where infrastructure is not there. Okay. So these are just some examples. So make use for multiple transportations, maybe reuse abandoned space, open spaces, and then historic and cultural resources that are a part of that city or a part of that landscape. Um, Whenever you go through those land use plans, and you figure out kind of what you want to do, you then have to decide on mechanisms for implementing those land use strategies. This comes in where you have state and regional planning agencies. Um, so you establish these planning agencies, and so this is more effective than local because the political boundaries seldom reflect the geological and biological database, right? So state and regional agencies are more effective than local because the state and regional typically fall around the boundaries, whereas local can be a little hairy or a little on the gray side in terms of where those boundaries are. And so a regional approach is more likely to prevent duplication of facilities and lead to greater efficiencies, right? So if one facility can do the same thing in two local areas and each local area doesn't know about it, right, and they build two instead of one, that's not being efficient. You're wasting resources, you're wasting space, right? You can also do restricting use, so zoning, where you regulate land use to basically what can be put there. So you're representing where their business or other developmental types of patterns can happen. So whether it's residential, retail, etc., right? You're making those decisions on what can be there. So these are just some examples. We're not going to go over this. You can kind of read through it on your own, but basically some examples of land use planning legislation. So for example, the California Coastal Act basically said that a coastal zone is extending 3 miles out to sea and 1,000 yards islands, and requires permits from the Coastal Commission for a local development within that zone. Basically, it's saying, you know, this coastal zone needs special permits in order for you to build in, and we define a coastal zone based off of these descriptions, right? And then here's examples of local growth management actions. So right, limit building permits, so the number of building permits in a specific location. So you only can have 500, and then that's based on planning. So like you have to show evidence that you plan for those. So you just look through these two lists, these two tables, giving examples, showing some examples of growth, so how they manage growth and how they manage land use planning, and where you can plan and etc. So now kind of moving into special urban planning issues. So urban transportation planning. Urban transportation is generally, kind of focusing on 4 specific goals. You want to conserve energy and land resources. You want efficient but inexpensive transportation. You want a transportation to suburban residents and not just the city residents, and you want to reduce urban pollution. So you want an effective transportation system that reduces pollution, reduces energy use, that's not expensive, but also allows access of the suburban residents to that inner city. And so the transportation corridors and parking facilities that you're going to use need to be included in your transportation plan. Okay. The issue though is that this mass transit system that we just basically outlined is generally, there's not enough funds to make it efficient and established. So it's often underfunded, and it's really difficult to get put into place and established because it's only financially kind of suitable along heavily populated areas, so where a lot of people are going to be using these transportation routes. It's also less convenient than an automobile. If a person can buy a car and take that car and drive straight to work and back, say in 2 hours, an hour there, hour back, and let's say they rode a bus that had many stops, and it turns that 2-hour commute into a 4-hour commute, right? Less convenient, more time that they have to spend traveling. Um, it's also expensive for the local governments or local cities to build and operate the public transportation. It's often crowded. Many people will be using it, and it's uncomfortable depending on how crowded it is. Um, and so the U.S. actually encourages personal automobiles by financing highways, cheap energy policy, and not funding mass transit products. Okay. So if we look at some statistics, 3/4 of the American population live in urban areas. Urban parks were generally considered uneconomical use of the land, but that idea, that outlook is beginning to change. We're starting to see the use in urban parks, not only in terms of making the cities look better, providing places for people to go, um, for not only aesthetics, but uh, health reasons. People can get out. It not only helps with physical health, but also mental health. And so just having places, open spaces in these urban areas are really useful. And so what we see now is a new outgrowth of urbanization is urban nature centers. So places where people can get outside in these open areas. We also have to look at the redevelopment of these inner cities, these portions of the inner city where you have these kind of decaying buildings that are just sitting around, not being used and falling down. Um, making the city just not aesthetically pleasing, making people not to want to be in that area. And so we have to put special efforts to revitalize the inner city. These abandoned industrial commercial sites are vacant because not only are they a lot of work, but they're just expensive to clean up and renovate. And so there's this brownfield development, and so it basically matches the degree of cleanup required to the intended use of the site. Um, and so if you're remodeling abandoned or commercial buildings into shopping centers or cultural facilities or high density housing, right, you're focusing on turning that inner area, that inner city, into a more useful, more efficient use of that land. Um, in terms of urban planning, looking at smart growth, where we're recognizing the benefits of growth in certain areas, right? So we're looking at emphasizing developing livable cities, right? Where we can live in a city that is environmentally friendly and it directly affects the quality of life, trying to have these efficient transportation systems where we're minimizing pollution and the cities are actually livable and usable by the people that live in them. So to do this, you're going to mix land uses. You're going to look at compact building designs, try to be efficient in space use, create a range of housing opportunities and choices, walkable neighborhoods, and you want attractive communities with a sense of belonging and place for the people that live there. So these open spaces, because you're preserving open space, natural beauty, farmland, environmental areas. You can develop already existing areas where that infrastructure is already there. Multiple transportation choices, whether you can provide bike pathways, walking pathways, trains, etc. But you want to do so around cost-effective development decisions so that the people can actually afford to be there. Encourage community and stakeholder collaboration in these development decisions for these cities as well. Looking at green buildings, so buildings that are built around a standard called LEED, so Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And basically what these buildings are doing is they're using recycled materials, better ventilation, reducing water and energy use, so trying to reduce the energy footprint of those buildings. And then finally, looking at characteristics of these high performance buildings is that they have those low flow water faucets. energy use is tested by an outside expert that can state for certain that this is kind of the energy use pattern and it's a lower energy use than say other buildings. The products do not contribute to say pollution or ozone layer depletion. Occupants can view the outside. They have natural day lighting on work surfaces, so they can actually, you know, feel the presence of the outdoors. And what's cool is a lot of the buildings on the UC Merced campus um, are meeting the LEED standard. And so a lot of the buildings they've built follow that standard. And you can actually go in and look on the buildings and see plaques and stuff that show that they are LEED certified and LEED buildings, basically these energy efficient buildings. And so the last thing we're going to talk about for this chapter is the federal government land use issues. Okay, so the federal government owns and manages about 30% of U.S. land. These are things like national parks, land management, forest service, fish and wildlife service. And so these agencies regulate and control these government lands. These agencies, depending on which one you're in, will have roles that may conflict with another agency. And so designation of certain lands as wilderness is a pretty hot topic. The Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act divided national forests into four categories: habitat preservation, recreation, lumbering, and watershed protection. So basically here, depending on what category it falls into, determines what can be done. So if you are a lumbering forest, trees can be cut down. Habitat preservation is pretty strict, and you're really not harvesting anything from that environment. And so again, depending on which of these four categories that forest falls into determines what is going to be done in those land use strategies. And so a lot of people want to use the natural world for recreation because they can kind of get out to the natural world, get some changes in their day-to-day life, kind of get away from everything. And others just kind of want to keep the beauty in some places and not really change or touch it. And what this leads to is you kind of have some conflicts because some activities cannot occur in the same place at the same time, right? So you can't have this pristine environment but also harvest resources. And so groups argue that if they pay taxes, they can use it any way they want to. But that's not entirely how everything works, because you have these ideas that kind of butt heads, and different groups want to use for different things, and so a lot of issues come up because of that. And so that's it for the chapter on land use. These are the summary pages, so as always, look over these for main ideas that you can find useful for studying from this chapter. Again, as always, these are not all of the ideas you need to know, but just a good starting point for studying. And if you have any questions, any concern, you can always email me. You can contact me through the discussion board. And I hope you have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you in the next chapter.